Welcome back to Philosophy for Sleep, where we explore the thoughts that tend to arrive in the quiet hours. Tonight, we will be reflecting on why you don't need to rush your life. So, get into a comfortable position. Let the room grow dark around you. Let the day begin to fade. And together, we'll take our time with this idea. Why does it feel like time becomes more visible when everything else goes quiet? There is something in the particular quality of stillness at the end of a day that causes the mind to turn inward. Tonight, we will move through the ideas of several philosophers and traditions whose thinking touches this experience in quiet but illuminating ways. You will hear from Edmund Husserl, who spent his life trying to understand how consciousness holds time together. From William James, who described thought as a continuous stream, never truly stopping. From Arthur Schopenhauer, who saw the human will as always reaching forward, always wanting the next thing. From Alfred Adler, who believed that human beings orient themselves not by their past, but by their imagined futures. From Baruch Spinoza, who understood that our emotional life is shaped not by events themselves, but by how the mind constructs them. From Michel de Montaigne, that deeply human French philosopher who spent decades examining the contents of his own mind with patience and without judgment. From Henri Bergson, who made a careful distinction between the time that clocks measure and the time that is actually lived. From the Stoic philosophers, particularly Marcus Aurelius and Epictetus, who developed precise tools for understanding what lies within a person's reach and what does not. From existential thinking, which holds that life does not follow a fixed sequence, and that its openness is a feature rather than an oversight, and from the ancient Taoist tradition, which has long understood that the deepest kind of movement is often the kind that cannot be seen. These ideas will not be presented as a lecture. They will move slowly, the way thoughts do when the mind is beginning to settle. Some of them will overlap, some will circle back. That is intentional. The goal is not to arrive anywhere quickly. The goal is to rest inside certain ideas long enough that they begin to feel less like information and more like understanding. The weight of the blanket, if there is one, is something you might notice now. The particular quality of dark in the room. The way breathing has already begun to deepen, just slightly, without any instruction. Let that be in the background. There is a room in the mind where time is kept. It is not a room most people visit consciously. It operates quietly, in the margins of awareness, gathering impressions and organizing them into a sequence that feels continuous. You were somewhere before this moment. You will be somewhere after it. And this moment connects to both in a way that feels somehow real. Edmund Husserl spent much of his philosophical life trying to understand exactly how that happens. He was a German philosopher working in the early 20th century, and his particular obsession was with consciousness itself, not with what the mind thinks about, but with the structures underneath thought that make thinking possible at all. One of those structures, he believed, was temporal. The mind does not experience time the way a clock measures it, in discrete, separate units. Instead, consciousness stretches across time in a fluid and continuous way. Husserl used the word retention for the way the mind holds the immediate past as still present. When you hear a piece of music, you do not simply hear one note at a time. and then forget the previous one. You carry the recent notes with you into the current moment, and they are still present in your awareness, just fading, the way a sound fades in a quiet room. Without this, you could not hear a melody. You would only ever hear a single note. And he used the word pretension for the way the mind leans forward into what is coming. You anticipate the next note before it arrives. You shape your expectation of the present moment by the horizon of what you feel is about to happen. This is not prediction exactly. It is more like a continuous leaning. Notice how that applies to your sense of where you are in life. The mind does not experience your life as a single still image. It holds your past as still present, in the same way it holds recent music. The years behind you carry a kind of resonance that continues to sound inside the current moment. And the mind leans forward into what it imagines is coming, shaping the present experience with a feeling about the future that is not yet here. The sense of being behind when it arrives operates within this structure. It is not a simple observation about facts. It is a temporal construction. The mind is comparing what it retains from the past with what it pretends about the future, and finding a gap in the present. And because the mind is always in this state of stretching between past and future, the present can feel insufficient. You may find that idea worth holding for a while. William James, the American philosopher and psychologist, approached time from a slightly different angle. He was interested in the texture of thought itself, and he described it with one of the most enduring images in the history of philosophy. The stream. Thought, James said, is not a series of separate moments. It flows. It is continuous. Even in sleep, the stream continues somewhere beneath the surface. What this means for the experience of urgency is something worth considering slowly. When you lie in the dark and feel that time is moving, that something should already be different, that thought is not an interruption of the stream. It is part of it. It has been carried along by the current all day, moving alongside everything else. And now that the day has grown quiet, it has become more audible. James was also one of the first thinkers to observe that the stream of thought is highly selective. The mind does not attend to everything equally. It emphasizes certain things and lets others pass in the background. What gets emphasized depends on what the mind has learned to treat as important. And one of the things that many minds learn to treat as very important is the question of progress, of movement, of visible change. So when you lie here and feel that sense of quiet unease, it is not simply a random arrival. It is the stream of thought doing what it always does, attending to what it has been trained to attend to. And training here is the right word, because the emphasis on visible, measurable, time-sensitive progress is something that develops. It has sources. It was not always there. Let that thought remain in the background for a while. The room around you is still. Whatever sounds exist outside, they are at a distance. There is a rhythm to the night that does not require anything from you. The mind, even as it measures, is resting inside a body that has already begun to slow. Arthur Schopenhauer believed that at the center of human experience there is something he called the will. He did not mean will in the ordinary sense, the kind associated with discipline or determination. He meant something more fundamental, a continuous striving, a restless forward movement that characterizes all living things, and that, in human beings, takes the form of desire. The will, for Schopenhauer, is never fully satisfied. It achieves one goal and immediately reaches for the next. The satisfaction of a desire provides only a momentary relief before the reaching begins again. This was not, for Schopenhauer, a problem to be solved. It was a description of the structure of human wanting itself. You may want to notice how that observation lands. There is something in the experience of lying here and feeling that life should be further along that echoes what Schopenhauer described. The mind reaches forward toward a version of life that would feel complete, that would feel like enough. And it experiences the present, the actual existing life, as a kind of interim state, a placeholder, a waiting room for the real arrival. Schopenhauer did not offer this observation to produce despair. He offered it as a form of understanding. When you see the reaching for what it is, the experience of it changes. Not immediately, and not completely. But something shifts when you recognize that the feeling of insufficiency is not a signal about your particular life. It is a signal about the nature of the will itself. The Stoic philosophers understood something related, though they arrived at it from a different direction. Marcus Aurelius, who was a Roman emperor in the 2nd century, and who wrote one of the most quietly remarkable books in the history of philosophy, returned again and again to a single question: what is within my reach, and what is not? The Stoics called this the dichotomy of control. Your thoughts, your choices, your efforts, your responses to events. These are within reach. The outcomes of those efforts, the timelines along which things happen, the pace at which the world responds, these are not. This distinction, held clearly, changes the quality of experience. When the mind reaches forward into a future that has not arrived, and measures the distance between where life is now and where it was expected to be, it is, in Stoic terms, attending to things outside its reach. The past cannot be altered. The rate at which change unfolds is not determined by wanting it to be faster. The particular shape a life takes is influenced by choice and effort, but it is not dictated by them. Many things that shape a life move at their own pace, in ways that remain partly outside any single person's direction. Marcus Aurelius wrote in the private notes that became his meditations, "Confine yourself to the present." He wrote this not as a command, but as a reminder to himself. He understood that the mind wanders into past regret and future anxiety, and that there is a particular quality of peace available in the actual present moment that tends to be obscured by those wanderings. You may find that sentence worth sitting with. Confine yourself to the present. Alfred Adler offered a complementary perspective. He was an Austrian psychologist, a contemporary of Freud, who came to believe that understanding a person required understanding not their past, but their direction. Human beings, Adler thought, are fundamentally future-oriented. They do not move through life pulled by their history, so much as they move through it drawn by a goal, an image of where they are heading. This is a quiet but significant idea. It means that the sense of time pressure is not simply about the past. It is about the imagined future, the specific version of a life that the mind has constructed as the destination, the goal toward which movement is supposed to be happening. When the present feels inadequate, it is usually because it is being compared to this imagined arrival. And here is something worth noticing slowly. The imagined future is a creation of the mind. It is constructed from information absorbed from many sources, cultural images, family expectations, the visible lives of others, memories of earlier hopes. It feels authoritative. It feels like an objective standard. But it is a picture painted inside the mind, and like all pictures, it says as much about the painter as it does about the subject. You may want to let that idea settle for a moment before moving on. The forward movement of thought, then, is not a flaw. It is one of the things that makes human beings capable of planning, creating, and building. The same quality that produces the feeling of urgency is the quality that makes it possible to care about anything at all. The reaching is not wrong. It simply benefits from being understood. Somewhere in the darkness of the room, there may be a sound, distant and indistinct, part of the texture of the night. The mind tends to register these sounds and release them without difficulty when it is not searching for meaning in them. Henri Bergson was a French philosopher who spent much of his career making a careful distinction that might, at first, seem obvious, but that becomes more interesting the longer you sit with it. He distinguished between time as it is measured and time as it is lived. Measured time, the time of clocks and calendars, is divided into equal units. Each second is the same as every other second. Each year contains the same number of days. This kind of time is uniform, external, and useful. It allows people to coordinate with each other, to plan, to arrive at the same place at the same moment. But this is not how time is actually experienced. Bergson used the French word durée, which translates roughly as duration, to describe lived time. Duration is not uniform. An hour of waiting feels different from an hour of deep conversation. A year of relative stillness can feel shorter in memory than a month of intense change. The mind does not move through time the way a hand moves around a clock. It moves through something more fluid, more textured, more continuous. Notice how that applies to the experience of looking back at a period of life and asking, what happened during that time? What changed? If the period was one of visible, external change, new location, new relationship, new work, the answer tends to feel clear. The mind has markers to organize the time around. It can point to the before and the after. But if the period was one of quieter development, learning that was mostly internal, understanding that deepened without dramatic event, emotional growth that happened beneath the surface of daily life, then the memory of it can feel sparse. It can feel like time that passed without content. But Bergson would say that the measurement of emptiness is a product of the clock-based model being applied to something that does not fit it. The mind is searching for external markers and finding few, and concluding from their absence that the time was empty. When in fact lived time is always full. It simply is not always full of the kinds of content that leave external marks. A tree grows in winter. The growth is not visible. The branches do not thicken in ways that can be observed from one day to the next. But the process of growth continues in the roots, in the cellular structures beneath the bark, in preparations for what spring will eventually make visible. The tree does not experience its winter as failure. That analogy is probably familiar, and its familiarity should not diminish it. The reason it has appeared in so many forms across so many traditions is that it describes something real about the relationship between invisible development and visible change. Bergson also wrote about what he called the cinematographic tendency of the mind. The mind, he thought, tends to perceive change by taking a series of still images and then playing them back as motion. This is how film works. A sequence of frozen frames, each slightly different from the last, produces the impression of continuous movement. But the movement is an impression, a reconstruction. The reality, Bergson believed, is continuous and cannot be fully captured in static frames. When you look at your life through the lens of this tendency, you see a series of images. Where you were then, where you are now, the gap between them, the expected image of where you should be by now. And from this sequence of stills, the mind constructs a narrative about pace, about progress, about whether things are moving fast enough. But the actual movement of a life is not a sequence of stills. It is durée. It is continuous, textured, layered. And a great deal of what matters most in a life happens in the spaces between the images. Let that remain in the background for a while. You may find that the room has grown quieter somehow, even though nothing about it has changed. This is something the mind does, naturally, as it settles. The sounds that were present before are still present, but they have moved to the edges of awareness. Bergson understood that the deep current of lived time carries within it a kind of intelligence, not the intelligence of planning and calculation, but something more like wisdom about pace. The body knows when it needs rest. The mind, when it is not being insisted upon too urgently, often knows what it needs next. There is a timing to development that is not arbitrary, but that operates according to its own logic, one that does not always correspond to the schedule that the mind has imposed. This is not mysticism. It is an observation about the difference between external time and internal rhythm. And the sense of urgency that arrives in the quiet hours is often, at its root, a friction between these two. The clock says one thing. The interior of the life says something else. And the mind, trained to trust the clock, interprets the difference as a problem. The feeling of being behind is not primarily a thought. It is an emotion, or more precisely, it is a cluster of emotions. Something like anxiety about the future, something like a mild dissatisfaction with the present, something like a vague comparison-based discomfort that has no single, clear object. Baruch Spinoza, the 17th century Dutch philosopher, developed a remarkably detailed account of how emotions work. He was interested, among many other things, in why emotions feel so self-evidently true when they arise. Fear feels like a perception of real danger. Shame feels like an accurate assessment of something actually shameful. And the sense of being behind, the sense that time is moving, and that something should already be different, feels like a straightforward recognition of reality. Spinoza would say that this is precisely where clarity is needed. Emotions, for Spinoza, are not perceptions of external reality. They are responses shaped by the mind's interpretation of reality. The same event, perceived differently, produces different emotional responses. Two people can occupy the same external situation and experience entirely different emotional states because they are processing that situation through different internal structures. This is not to say that emotions are unreliable or that they should be dismissed. Spinoza held emotions in considerable respect. They are, he believed, a form of intelligence. They carry information about the relationship between the self and the world, but they are only as accurate as the perceptions that generate them. And perceptions, especially perceptions about something as complex as one's life and its relationship to time, are almost always partial. The perception that produces the sense of being behind is built from several components. A comparison between where life is now and where it was expected to be. A sense that the expected timeline was authoritative and correct. A feeling that the gap between them represents something meaningful about the quality or adequacy of the life being lived. Each of these components is worth examining on its own. The comparison itself is a mental act. It requires an image of the expected position, which, as noted earlier, is a construction derived from cultural inputs, family messages, the visible lives of others, and older versions of the self's own wishes. This image feels objective, but it is assembled from many sources, most of which were absorbed without explicit evaluation. The sense that the expected timeline is authoritative is also worth noticing. There is an assumption beneath the urgency that says, things should have happened by a certain time, and if they have not, something has gone wrong. But where does that sense of should come from? Who established the timeline, and by what authority? These are not rhetorical questions. They are genuine inquiries that, if pursued with patience and honesty, tend to reveal something interesting. The timelines that feel most authoritative are often the ones that were absorbed earliest and most silently, from parents who expressed certain hopes, from a culture that celebrates certain ages and certain markers, from peers who reached certain landmarks at certain times, from an earlier version of the self who made plans without knowing what could and could not be known. Montaigne, that remarkable French essayist of the 16th century, spent decades writing about the contents of his own mind with a candor that was unusual for his time and remains unusual now. He was not a systematic philosopher in the way that Husserl or Spinoza were. He was something more like a very honest observer of his own inner life, someone who took the experience of being a particular human being seriously enough to examine it from many angles over many years. One of the things Montaigne observed, again and again, was how much of what the mind takes to be objective reality is actually a product of its own operations. The mind, he found, is an unreliable narrator of the self's experience. It emphasizes certain things and downplays others according to tendencies that often have little to do with the actual significance of the events being processed. Montaigne wrote in one of his essays that every man carries the form of the whole human condition within him. He meant by this that the experiences he was describing in himself were not idiosyncratic. They were human. The tendency to measure oneself against imagined standards, to feel inadequate relative to an expected version of one's life, to experience urgency without a clear external cause. These are features of being a thinking, self-aware creature, not signs of individual failure. This is worth noticing. The experience of lying in the dark and feeling that something should already be different is not a sign that something is actually wrong with the particular life being lived. It is a sign that the mind is doing what minds do, comparing, measuring, evaluating, and arriving at conclusions that carry emotional weight. The emotional weight is real. That is important to acknowledge. This is not a reflection that is trying to talk you out of the feeling. The feeling is there, and it has a texture and a presence that deserves to be met with some honesty. What changes with understanding is not necessarily the feeling itself. It is the relationship to the feeling, the degree to which the feeling is taken as a final verdict rather than as one signal among many. Let that sit for a while. Spinoza believed that clarity about the causes of an emotion changes its quality. When you understand why you feel what you feel, the emotion does not necessarily disappear, but it becomes more transparent. It is less likely to be mistaken for a perception of objective reality. And in becoming more transparent, it becomes more workable, not manageable, in the sense of being suppressed or overridden. Workable, in the sense of being possible to relate to with some degree of understanding. The room is still. The breathing has its own rhythm. The thoughts that are moving through the mind right now are part of a stream that will continue in its own way, even as awareness softens and deepens toward rest. There is a particular kind of discomfort that comes from the sense that life is supposed to follow a certain order. Education, then work, then relationship, then home, then stability, and then something that might be called arrival. Each stage is supposed to follow from the previous one in a sequence that feels natural because it has been described often enough to seem inevitable. Existential philosophy, in many of its forms, takes a different view. The existentialist tradition, which developed primarily in the 20th century through the work of thinkers like Jean-Paul Sartre, Simone de Beauvoir, Albert Camus, and their predecessors like Søren Kierkegaard, is a broad and sometimes internally disagreeing family of ideas. But one theme runs through much of it: the absence of a predetermined structure for a human life. Sartre's often quoted formulation is that existence precedes essence. By this he meant that human beings do not arrive in the world with a fixed nature or purpose already inscribed in them. They exist first, and they make themselves through their choices, their actions, their relationships, and their responses to circumstances. There is no blueprint. There is no essential sequence. This is sometimes presented as a terrifying idea. If there is no predetermined structure, then there is no external authority to appeal to when the question of whether life is progressing correctly arises. There is no cosmic schedule against which the current position can be verified. But that terror, if it is felt, tends to contain within it an assumption worth examining. The assumption that a life without a fixed sequence is a life without direction. That openness is the same thing as emptiness. That the absence of a predetermined script means the absence of meaning. These equivalences are not necessary. A life can have deep direction without following a prescribed sequence. It can move with purpose and intention without adhering to a culturally inherited timeline. The markers that culture identifies as signs of progress, a certain age for a certain achievement, a certain order for certain life events, are not the only markers available. They are the ones that are most visible, most legible to other people, most celebrated in shared social life. But visibility and significance are not the same thing. Kierkegaard, who preceded the French existentialists by nearly a century, wrote about what he called the stages of life. But he was careful to note that these stages were not sequential in the way that age-related milestones are sequential. They were orientations, modes of engagement with existence, and a person could inhabit them in different orders, or revisit them, or find themselves moving between them in ways that had no external visibility. De Beauvoir, writing in the middle of the 20th century, was particularly attentive to the way that cultural scripts for a life, and especially for a woman's life, were mistaken for natural facts. The sequence, she argued, was imposed, not discovered, and the feeling of failure that arose when the sequence was not followed was not a response to genuine inadequacy. It was a response to the gap between an actual life and an imposed pattern. This is not an argument for rejecting all structure or all sequence. Some sequences have deep logic to them. Learning requires a certain foundation before certain heights become accessible. Trust develops over time in ways that cannot be hurried. The body's capabilities change in stages that follow their own biological rhythm. Some things genuinely do need to come before other things, but many of the sequences that carry the most emotional weight, the ones that produce the sharpest sense of being behind when they are not followed, are not grounded in this kind of deep logic. They are grounded in convention, in cultural expectation, in the averaging of many different lives into a single idealized trajectory that, in reality, fits very few individual lives well. Camus wrote about the absurd, by which he meant the gap between the human desire for clear meaning and the world's refusal to provide it cleanly. But he did not think the response to this gap should be despair. His response was something more like a committed, clear-eyed engagement with life in its actual form, rather than in the form that desire insists it should take. There is something in this that applies to the experience of urgency. The mind desires a clear sequence, a visible map from here to there, with checkpoints that can be verified and ticked. The actual experience of living tends not to provide this so cleanly. Things develop in ways that are partially visible and partially not. Progress in some areas makes room for understanding in others that were not anticipated. The path bends in ways that the earlier map did not show. And the mind, encountering this discrepancy, can interpret it as failure, as evidence that something is wrong, when, in fact, what is being described is simply the texture of actual human development, which has never been as linear as the cultural scripts suggest. You may want to notice how that idea settles in you. The sense of being behind requires a fixed sequence against which current position can be measured. When the fixedness of that sequence is examined and found to be more constructed than inevitable, the sense of being behind becomes less certain. Not absent, not resolved, but less certain. And uncertainty, in this case, is not a problem. It is a more accurate relationship to reality. Somewhere in the body there is a releasing, a small and quiet letting go that happens below the level of decision. The body understands rest better than the mind does. It has been moving toward it all day. The mind is simply the last part to arrive. The Taoist tradition, which developed in ancient China and finds its most celebrated expression in the Tao Te Ching, attributed to the legendary figure Laozi, offers a perspective on time, and unfolding that is different in character from the Western philosophical traditions explored in the earlier chapters. It does not proceed through argument or analysis. It proceeds through image and suggestion, through a kind of pointing that allows the meaning to arrive by way of recognition rather than proof. The central concept of Taoism is the Tao, which translates approximately as the way. But the Tao is not a path, in the sense of a sequence of steps to be followed. It is more like the natural order that underlies and moves through all things. It is the quality of river water finding its way to the sea, not by forcing or by planning, but by always moving in the direction that circumstances allow. It is the quality of seasons changing, each in its own time, without urgency or delay. Laozi wrote, in one of the most frequently quoted passages of the Tao Te Ching, "The Tao does nothing, yet leaves nothing undone." That paradox is worth sitting with for some time. It is saying something about the relationship between effort and outcome that is almost the opposite of what the urgency mind assumes. The urgency mind assumes that visible effort, constant movement, sustained pressure applied to the future is how things get accomplished. That stillness is the same as stagnation. That rest is the same as falling behind. The Tao suggests something different, that there is a kind of action, Wu Wei it is called in Chinese, that is not the same as forcing. Wu Wei is often translated as non-action, but this translation is slightly misleading. It does not mean doing nothing. It means acting in alignment with the natural movement of things, rather than against it. The way a sailor works with the wind, rather than trying to push the boat through still water with brute force. Applied to the experience of a life, this suggests that there is a difference between the effort that aligns with the actual current of development and the effort that fights against timing, against natural pace, against the particular rhythm of this particular life. The first kind of effort tends to produce results that feel, in retrospect, surprisingly easy. The second kind tends to produce exhaustion without proportionate progress, because it is fighting something that cannot be fought directly. The feeling of urgency is often a signal from the second kind of effort. It is the mind trying to push the boat through still water. And the water is still not because there is something wrong with the water. It is still because this is not the moment for the current. The current will come. It tends to come when the conditions are right, and those conditions are not always within full control. The Tao Te Ching also says, in various translations, "To the mind that is still, the whole universe surrenders." There is a quality of attention available in genuine stillness that is different from the quality of attention available in urgency. When the mind is quiet, things that were not visible before become visible, not because they were hidden maliciously, but because attention, when it is urgent, narrows. It focuses on the gap between the present and the desired future, and in doing so, it becomes less able to notice what is already present and already developing. The Taoist tradition places a high value on something it calls zirun, which translates approximately as self-so, or naturalness, the quality of things being what they are, following their own nature, without being forced into shapes they are not. A plant grows toward the light, not because it is trying to do so, but because that is its nature. And the growth of a human life has something of this same quality. It follows its own nature, which is partly given and partly constructed through choice, but which always has a particular rhythm that belongs to it, and not to the average of all other lives. The sense of urgency tends to obscure this naturalness. It insists that the growth should look a certain way, happen at a certain rate, produce visible markers at certain intervals. And in insisting, it creates a friction with the actual current of development that is neither necessary nor useful. You may find yourself thinking about this in relation to something specific in your own life. A development that has been slower than expected. An area where movement has been less visible than hoped. A time that, from the outside, might have appeared to be stagnation. Let that thought be present without immediately asking it to do anything. The Tao also has something to say about what appears to be opposite of movement. Water, which is the central image of the Tao Te Ching, is soft. It yields. It flows around obstacles rather than attempting to demolish them directly. And yet over time, water shapes stone. The soft overcomes the hard, not through force, but through persistence and patience and alignment with gravity. This is not a consolation offered to make difficulty feel less difficult. It is an observation about the long arc of certain kinds of development. Some things genuinely require time, not because they are complicated, but because they involve the accumulation of experience and understanding that cannot be rushed without being damaged. A fruit forced to ripen ahead of its season loses the complexity it would have had if it had been allowed its full time. These images are ancient, and they are ancient for a reason. They describe something that human beings across very different cultures and very different centuries have recognized as true about the relationship between time and development. Laozi also wrote, "Nature does not hurry, yet everything is accomplished." Notice how that sentence lands. The universe operates without urgency. Stars take billions of years to form. Mountains rise over geological time in increments that no single human life can observe directly. The deep structures of the world have no apparent awareness of the human need for visible progress within a human-length time frame. And yet, from within those vast, unhurried processes, extraordinary things emerge. The human life is smaller in scale than a star or a mountain, but the principle may apply across scales. The things that matter most, the depth of understanding, the quality of connection, the sense of having built something genuine, these tend to develop on their own time scale. They are less like structures that can be built quickly with sufficient will and resources, and more like ecosystems that require particular conditions and time that cannot be fully substituted by effort alone. The mind that is settling toward sleep is already demonstrating something about this. It is releasing the urgency, not because a decision was made to release it, but because the natural movement of the body and the quiet of the room and the particular quality of late-night awareness are conditions under which urgency becomes harder to sustain. And in its softening, something else becomes more available. A broader awareness, a gentler relationship to the question of where life currently stands. Before moving forward, it may be worth pausing here in a different way, not to consider more ideas, but to notice what is already present. There is the particular weight of the body at this hour, the way fatigue distributes itself, not uniformly, but in certain regions that have carried more than others through the day, the way the surface beneath you receives that weight, and the way the body responds to being received. These are small and quiet facts. They have been there the whole time. The attention simply had not landed on them until now. The quality of the dark in the room is worth noticing too. Darkness is not uniform. It has texture and depth. Objects in the room become suggestions rather than definite things. The edges of familiar shapes soften. And in that softening, there is something that the urgency mind cannot easily access. A simple perception of what is present, without evaluation. This is what Bergson was pointing toward when he wrote about duration. The quality of lived experience that exists prior to the measuring. Before the mind organizes the moment into evidence for or against some conclusion, the moment itself, in its full texture, is always richer than the concepts applied to it. You may want to sit with the texture of right now for a moment, without asking it to be anything in particular. The thoughts about time and progress, and where the life currently stands, have not disappeared. They are still present somewhere in the background. But they have become one feature of the current experience, rather than the only feature. And that shift in proportion, the thoughts becoming smaller relative to the whole of what is present, is itself a form of perspective. This is not an achievement. It is simply what happens when the frame widens slightly, when the mind allows itself to include more than the evaluating function tends to include. The room, the body, the dark, the quiet sound of the night, the breathing that continues without being asked to. These things are also part of right now. And right now, in its full form, is not a problem. It is simply the present moment, with everything in it. It may be worth considering what actually happens inside a single ordinary day, not in terms of tasks completed or visible progress made, but in terms of the invisible architecture of experience that accumulates beneath the surface. From the moment of waking, the mind begins a continuous process of perception, interpretation, comparison, and response. Most of this happens automatically, below the threshold of explicit awareness. The body navigates its environment. The attention moves from one thing to another, following patterns that were established over years of habit and learning. Decisions are made, most of them small, some of them more significant, without the full attention of deliberate reflection being brought to bear on each one. Information enters through all of the senses and is processed in ways that the conscious mind is not aware of. Impressions form. Emotional responses arise and settle. Connections are made between new experiences and older ones. The understanding of a situation deepens, sometimes across a single conversation, sometimes across an entire day's worth of small interactions. All of this is happening continuously inside every ordinary day, and none of it leaves the kind of mark that the urgency mind counts as progress. The urgency mind is looking for the completed task, the achieved milestone, the visible evidence of movement from one point to another. It has a model of progress that is primarily external and primarily categorical. Either the thing is done or it is not. Either the milestone has been reached or it has not. Either the position in life has changed or it has not. But the actual substance of a day is not organized this way. It is organized more like the development of a musical understanding through repeated listening. Each time you hear a piece of music you know well, you hear something you did not hear before. The progression that seemed to go in one direction reveals a complexity you had missed. A passage that seemed simple resolves into something delicate. This does not happen because the music has changed. It happens because the listener has changed, gradually, through accumulated experience of listening. The same is true of the ordinary experiences that accumulate inside a day and inside years of days. The understanding of a particular kind of relationship deepens through experience of many relationships, not through a single insight or a single achievement. The capacity to respond well in a difficult situation develops through having been in difficult situations before, not through having read about them. The patience that certain kinds of meaningful work require is developed through the practice of that work, day by day, in ordinary time. None of this leaves the kind of mark that the urgency mind tracks. And so, the urgency mind, looking at the record of a day or a week or a period of life, can look at something full of invisible development and see emptiness. This is worth pausing over. The perception of emptiness is a product of looking with the wrong instrument. You may find that idea worth holding quietly for a while. There is a particular intensification of urgency that comes from comparison. When the mind measures its own position not just against an imagined future, but against the visible position of other people, something shifts in the quality of the discomfort. Comparison with others has a different emotional texture than simple forward-reaching. It adds something that Spinoza would have recognized as a complex emotion, an admixture of what Spinoza called desire, with something like envy, with something like inadequacy, all organized around the perception that another person is where the mind believes it should be. The problem with this is structural, and it is worth naming clearly. When you observe the visible markers of another person's life, what you are seeing is, in every meaningful sense, incomplete information. You see the achievement, but not the years of unglamorous daily effort that produced it. You see the relationship, but not the difficulties navigated within it. You see the position, but not the doubts and uncertainties that coexist with it. You see the surface, and not the interior, and you are comparing that surface to the full interior of your own life, including all of its ambivalence, all of its uncertainty, all of the invisible development that has not yet produced visible results. This comparison is not between equals. It is between a curated exterior and a raw interior. Montaigne was deeply aware of this. He wrote with considerable honesty about the inner life, the doubts that accompany what looks like confidence from outside, the uncertainty that lives inside what appears from outside to be settled. He did this not to diminish himself or others, but to be accurate. He understood that the interior of any life contains far more complexity than its exterior communicates. The person you are comparing yourself to is conducting exactly the same interior experience that you are. They are carrying their own version of the urgency mind, their own assessment of what should already be different, their own quiet unease in the night hours. Their visible markers may be different from yours, but the interior experience of being a self-aware creature moving through time is not. This does not dissolve the discomfort of comparison, but it changes its meaning. The person ahead, as the comparison mind frames them, is not ahead in any comprehensive sense. They are simply visible in a different set of categories. And the categories that a culture makes most visible are not necessarily the categories in which the most important development happens. There is a useful question buried inside the experience of urgency, and it is worth drawing it out slowly. The question is, what gets counted? The urgency mind has a counting system. It counts visible achievements, milestones, external markers of a life's position. These counts feel natural and obvious. They feel like what anyone would count. But the counting system itself is a choice, even if it does not feel like one. And a different counting system would produce a different assessment. What would it mean to count differently? It would mean counting the development of genuine understanding, in whatever area that understanding has deepened, without requiring it to have produced visible external results. It would mean counting the relationships that have become more honest and more mutual over time, even when they have not produced anything that a culture recognizes as an achievement. It would mean counting the growth in capacity to be present with difficulty, without being destroyed by it. It would mean counting the accumulated experience of being a particular self in a particular life, with all of the texture and complexity that produces. None of these things appear in the counting systems that culture provides. They do not map onto milestones or timelines. They cannot be compared across lives in a simple way. They are deeply interior and highly individual. But they are not less real for being uncountable. They are, in many people's considered reflection on what mattered in a life, among the most important things: the quality of attention, the depth of understanding, the genuineness of connection, the capacity to be present with what is, rather than only reaching toward what is not yet. Epictetus, the Stoic philosopher who had been born into slavery, and who became one of the most remarkable teachers of his time, was particularly attentive to the distinction between things that matter and things that are counted. He understood, from his own experience, that the things a society counts and values are not always the things that constitute a genuinely good life. And he spent a great deal of his teaching pointing toward the interior qualities, the ones that cannot be measured or compared or taken away, as the actual substance of a well-lived life. He was not dismissing external achievement. He was placing it in proportion. External achievements, for Epictetus, were preferred things, genuinely good to have, but not the foundation of a good life. The foundation was something else: the quality of response to what happens, the clarity about what is within reach, the consistency between what is valued and how one actually lives. These interior qualities are being developed, or they are not, in every ordinary day. And their development does not produce the kind of external evidence that the urgency mind counts. But their development is real, and its effects are felt gradually and then suddenly in how a life proceeds. It may be worth spending some time with the idea that a life, considered whole, has a different quality than any single period within it. There is a tendency, particularly in the quiet hours, to evaluate a life by its current chapter, to take the existing evidence, the present circumstances, the visible markers and their absence, and to extrapolate from them toward a conclusion about the whole. This is understandable. The current chapter is the only one available to experience directly. The future chapters have not arrived, and the past chapters, however they went, are past. But the conclusions that the current chapter seems to support are almost always partial. Not because things will necessarily improve, although they often do in unexpected ways, but because life, understood as a whole arc, does not follow the logic of any single point within it. The significance of a period of quiet development often becomes clear only in retrospect, when the development it made possible has become visible. The significance of a period of apparent stagnation often becomes clear when the rest it provided, or the understanding it allowed to deepen, has become apparent. The philosopher's task, in the face of this, is not to predict what the future will reveal. It is to hold the current chapter within a wider frame than urgency provides. To allow the possibility that what appears to be insufficient movement may be, from a wider view, a period of gathering. That what appears to be delay may be, from a wider view, necessary preparation. This is not wishful thinking. Wishful thinking projects a specific desired outcome and then works backward to make the current evidence seem compatible with it. What is being suggested here is different. It is simply a widening of the frame, a recognition that the current evidence does not settle the question of the whole. Montaigne wrote near the end of one of his later essays, "I study myself more than any other subject. It is my metaphysics. It is my physics." He spent his life as a careful, honest, and somewhat amused observer of himself. And one of the things he observed was that the mind's assessments of its own condition are rarely final. What felt like conclusion was often the beginning of understanding. What felt like stagnation was often preparation. The mind, he found, moves at its own pace and cannot easily be hurried without something being lost. The same quality of attention that Montaigne brought to his own inner life is available to anyone who is willing to sit with it. It requires a certain patience, a willingness to stay with an experience without immediately insisting that it resolve into something more comfortable. And it tends to reveal, over time, a texture and depth that urgency makes impossible to notice. The Stoics understood that the quality of a life is determined more by the quality of attention brought to it than by the external circumstances that surround it. Marcus Aurelius was an emperor. He managed wars, plagues, political crises, and the constant pressures of enormous responsibility. And yet his private notebooks are filled with quiet, careful observations about the quality of attention and the importance of returning again and again to what is within reach, not because nothing else mattered, but because what is within reach is all that any person can actually work with. Everything else is weather, the weather of a life, the circumstances that arrive and depart, the pace at which things change, the timing of developments that were hoped for but could not be forced. This weather is real, and its effects are real. But the quality of attention that meets the weather is something else, and that quality can be cultivated independently of what the weather is doing. You may want to notice how different those two things feel. There is a particular quality of time that is worth naming. It is the time of development that is not visible as development. The time when things are changing in ways that cannot yet be seen, and the mind, in the absence of visible evidence, concludes that nothing is happening. Almost everyone who has looked back at a period of their life with the benefit of distance has had the experience of recognizing that something significant was happening during a time that, from within it, felt uneventful or even stagnant. the understanding that was quietly deepening, the change in how certain things were processed, the gradual shift in what mattered and what did not. These changes do not always announce themselves. They do not send notifications. They develop below the surface of daily awareness and become visible later, in how things are approached, in what responses arise in new situations, in the kind of clarity that is suddenly available where there was confusion before. Bergson's concept of duration helps here. In lived time, everything is connected. The seemingly uneventful period is not a blank. It is part of the continuous flow that also includes the periods of visible change. And the periods of visible change are rarely fully explained by the immediate circumstances that surround them. They draw on what was gathered earlier, in quieter times. The seed underground does not experience itself as making progress, if it experiences anything at all. But the conditions for what it is becoming are being assembled in ways that have no surface manifestation. Until they do. This image is not meant to suggest passivity. The seed underground is not doing nothing. Cellular processes are active. Something is happening. But what is happening is not visible, and it would not be improved by urgency. If urgency were somehow possible underground, the same quality of invisible development characterizes many of the most important things in a human life: the development of character, the deepening of understanding, the gradual shift in what a person is able to receive and offer in relationships, the accumulation of a perspective that can only come from having been through a certain amount of time and a certain variety of experience. These things happen, but they happen in the interior, in ways that external measurement cannot reliably track. And so the quiet that the mind sometimes misinterprets as stagnation may be, at least in part, a quiet of the surface, while something deeper continues. It is worth spending a little time with where the timeline comes from, the timeline against which the sense of being behind is measured, where it was assembled, whose voice speaks when the mind says, "You should be further along by now." Every culture produces narratives about the expected shape of a life. These narratives change over historical time. What was expected at 30 in one century is different from what is expected at 30 in another. What was considered a life well-shaped in one culture looks entirely different from what is considered a life well-shaped in a neighboring culture. The variation is vast, and yet within any given cultural moment, the narrative feels like a fact of nature rather than a cultural product. The age by which certain things should have happened, the order in which milestones should appear, the visibility that constitutes evidence of adequate progress, these carry the weight of the obvious, of the way things simply are. But they are not the way things simply are. They are the way things are organized within a particular cultural imagination. And that imagination is assembled from economic conditions, historical circumstances, technological possibilities, demographic patterns, and inherited assumptions that have no necessary relationship to the actual logic of individual human development. The comparison with the visible lives of others is particularly worth examining. When the mind compares its own position to the position of others, it is comparing depth to surface. It is comparing the interior experience of a life, with all its complexity and ambivalence and invisible development, to the curated exterior of another life. This comparison is almost always unfavorable, not because the life being compared against is actually richer or more advanced, but because the comparison is structurally unequal. You see the outside of other lives. You experience the inside of your own. The inside of any life experienced from within contains more uncertainty, more ambivalence, more ordinary difficulty than the outside of that same life communicates to others. This is not deception. It is simply the natural difference between inner experience and outer presentation. Adler, who was so attentive to the future orientation of human beings, was also attentive to the role of social comparison in shaping a person's sense of themselves. He called this the individual's fictional final goal, the imagined state of completion toward which all striving is directed. And he noted that this fictional goal was often assembled, in part from what other people appeared to have, from what the culture defined as success, from images of completeness that were external rather than genuinely internal. When the fictional final goal is assembled primarily from external sources, the comparison between the actual life and the imagined goal feels like a comparison against an objective standard. But it is a comparison against a construction made partly of other people's surfaces, partly of cultural ideals, partly of older wishes that may or may not still fit the actual shape of who this person has become. This is not an argument for rejecting all comparison or all external reference. Other lives are genuinely informative. Seeing what others have achieved or built or navigated can expand the sense of what is possible. But comparison is most useful when it is held lightly, as information rather than verdict. When it is seen as one input among many, rather than as the final judge of adequacy. The verdict belongs, if it belongs anywhere, to the actual life being lived, to the person who has full access to its interior. And even then, verdicts made from inside a single period of a life tend to be partial. The story continues. The meaning of any chapter is partly determined by what comes after it. There is a misunderstanding that the urgency mind carries about stillness. It tends to understand stillness as the absence of movement, as something to be passed through on the way to real activity, as a failure state that will eventually, with sufficient effort, be converted into progress. But stillness, in the traditions that have spent the most time with it, is not the absence of anything. It is a different quality of presence. The Taoist tradition speaks of the stillness at the center of movement, the eye of the cyclone that makes the cyclone's movement possible. The Stoics spoke of the quality of equanimity that makes genuine action possible by freeing it from the distortion of panic. The Buddhist traditions, adjacent to Taoism in certain ways, speak of stillness as the ground from which clear perception arises. In none of these traditions is stillness understood as stagnation. It is understood as a different mode, one that is as active as movement in its own way, but that requires a different kind of attention to notice. The mind in the quiet hours, when the day has ended and the room has grown still, is not failing. It is not falling behind. It is doing something that the day, with its demands and distractions and continuous forward pull, does not easily allow. It is gathering itself. It is processing, in ways that happen below explicit awareness, the content of the day. It is allowing understanding to settle and integrate in ways that urgency would prevent. Sleep itself is the most obvious version of this. During sleep, the brain performs consolidation of memory, processing of emotional experience, restoration of attention, and cognitive clarity. None of this happens as work that the sleeping person is consciously doing. It happens as a natural process, in stillness, and it produces results that would not be available without it. The stillness of the quiet hours before sleep is a version of the same process, already beginning. The day's activity is settling. The thoughts that are arising now, the ones that seem so insistent and meaningful, are part of that settling. They are not necessarily as urgent as they feel. They are the mind's way of processing the material of the day, and they will continue in some form through the night, as part of the natural rhythm of recovery and integration. There is a kind of knowledge that lives in the body, and that is different from the knowledge that lives in the mind's explicit reasoning. The body knows when it is tired. It knows with a certainty that does not require argument, when it needs rest, and when it needs movement, and when it needs nourishment. These signals do not arrive as conclusions reached through deliberation. They arrive as direct information. The urgency that the mind carries about the pace and progress of life does not usually have this quality. It is not a signal from the body in the way that tiredness is a signal from the body. It is a signal from the mind's evaluative function, which is doing what evaluative functions do: assessing, comparing, determining adequacy. But the evaluative function is not always the most reliable guide to what is true about a life. It works from available information, and available information is always partial. It works from learned comparison points, and those comparison points are culturally constructed. It works from an imagined standard that feels objective, but is assembled from many sources, none of which have final authority. The body, by contrast, tends to have a more direct relationship with the actual condition of the life. When the life has been too busy for too long, the body reports this. When the life has been too sedentary, the body reports this. When something that the mind is doing is out of alignment with what the life actually needs, the body tends to know, even if the mind is occupied elsewhere. This is not a mystical claim. It is an observation about different processing systems and their different relationships to certain kinds of information. The body carries information about actual state, about genuine need, about the rhythm of development that is particular to this organism at this point in its history. And in the quiet before sleep, some of that information becomes more available. The pace of breathing, the weight of limbs, the particular quality of physical fatigue at the end of a day. These are not failures. They are accurate reports. William James was interested in what he called the fringe of consciousness, the area of awareness that surrounds the clear, focused center of attention, and that carries a great deal of information that the focused center tends to miss. Most of the time, the fringe is occupied by what James called the sense of relations, the felt sense of connection, of context, of how this moment relates to what came before and what might come after. It is a kind of peripheral awareness that gives the stream of thought its coherence. In the quiet hours, the fringe becomes more available. The center of attention softens, and the broader awareness that surrounds it comes forward. And in that broader awareness, the life tends to appear differently than it does in the focused, evaluating mode. It appears less as a project to be assessed, and more as something being lived, something ongoing, something that contains more than the current chapter indicates. There is a particular fantasy that the urgency mind tends to sustain. It is the fantasy of arrival, the sense that at some point, once a certain number of things are in place, the life will feel finished, complete. The sense of urgency will resolve into a sense of sufficiency. The reaching will pause. But Schopenhauer's observation is relevant here. The will, he noted, does not rest at the destination. It registers the arrival briefly, and then begins reaching toward the next horizon. This is not a flaw in the structure of desire. It is the structure of desire. And understanding it means understanding that arrival, in the sense of a final completion that resolves the sense of urgency permanently, is not likely to arrive in the way the urgency mind imagines. This might seem like a discouraging observation, but it contains something useful. If arrival is not the resolution of urgency, then urgency is not pointing toward arrival. It is simply one of the mind's modes, an assessment mode that arises when certain conditions are present, and that can arise regardless of how much has been achieved or how far a life has come. The person who has achieved a great deal can feel urgently behind relative to the next imagined destination. The person who is early in a life, with many possibilities still open, can feel urgently behind relative to some expected point of visible progress. The urgency itself does not indicate the actual state of the life. It indicates the state of the evaluative function at this particular moment, which does not mean ignoring it. The evaluative function carries real information sometimes, genuine dissatisfaction with something that could and should change, accurate recognition that energy has been going in a direction that does not actually align with what matters. These are real signals worth attending to. But the quiet urgency of the night, the kind that arises without a specific object, the kind that is more like a general unease about pace and position, and whether things are moving in the right direction, this kind is more likely to be the evaluative function doing its habitual work in the absence of specific content, and it tends to soften, not through argument, but through time and through the particular quality of late-night awareness that is already, even now, beginning to shift. There is something worth noting about the fact that this kind of reflection tends to happen at night. It is not random. The conditions of nighttime, the darkness, the quiet, the physical stillness, the withdrawal from the day's activity, create a particular kind of mental environment in which certain thoughts become available that were not available before. The Stoics practiced something they called evening review, a deliberate end-of-day reflection in which the events and choices of the day were examined calmly and honestly. Marcus Aurelius's Meditations are largely a record of this kind of reflection. Epictetus's teachings return again and again to the idea of pausing at the end of the day to consider what has been within reach and what has not. Montaigne, who was not a Stoic, but who read the Stoics carefully, practiced a version of this in his writing. He used the act of writing about his own mind as a way of examining it more carefully than was possible in the movement of daily life. The writing was slow. The thinking was slow. And in that slowness, things became visible, that faster thinking tended to pass over. The philosophical traditions, almost without exception, have understood night-time as a particularly fruitful time for this kind of inward attention. Not because night is magical, but because the conditions of night create the space that is rarely available during the day. The absence of demand, the physical grounding in stillness, the natural movement of the body toward rest. In these conditions, the mind is capable of a different kind of thinking, less directed, less focused on solving specific problems, more receptive, more able to hold complexity without insisting that it resolve into a simple conclusion. The thoughts that arise in this space are not always comfortable. Some of them are the thoughts that the urgency brings. But they are also thoughts that, met with the kind of patient attention that the night allows, tend to reveal more of their own structure. They become more understandable. And understanding, as Spinoza knew, changes the emotional texture of experience. Whatever this moment feels like, whatever the assessment function is currently producing, the life continues. This is not a reassurance offered to produce comfort. It is simply a description of reality. The life continues, and it continues in ways that include things that cannot currently be seen. Understanding deepens in directions that are not yet apparent. Connections form between experiences that have not yet been connected. Qualities that have been developing slowly, below the surface of awareness, approach a threshold where they will become visible, in action or in understanding, or in the character of what is built or offered to others. The Taoist understanding of Wu Wei, of action that aligns with the natural current rather than fighting it, suggests that much of what actually moves a life forward happens without the mind's urgent intervention. The urgent intervention is not always what produces the result. Sometimes what produces the result is the patient continuation, the daily practice, the maintained attention, the consistent showing up, even when the showing up does not produce immediately visible results. And sometimes what produces the result is the rest, the integration that happens in sleep, the perspective that becomes available after stepping back, the clarity that emerges from a period of relative stillness that allowed things to settle. The urgency mind finds this hard to believe. It understands action as the only productive mode. But productivity, understood more broadly, includes the conditions that make the best action possible. And those conditions require rest, integration, patience, and the kind of sustained attention that urgency undermines. The breathing has its own rhythm now. It is something that was already happening before attention was brought to it, and it will continue after attention moves elsewhere. It does not require management. It does not require urgency. It simply continues as the body continues, as the life continues. The darkness of the room has a particular quality at this hour. It is not empty darkness. It is full of the ordinary richness of a night, the subtle sounds at the edges of hearing, the particular temperature of the air, the weight of rest that is gathering in the body. Somewhere in the background, the thoughts continue. They are quieter now. They have less urgency. The evaluative function is still present somewhere, but it has moved to the periphery, where it belongs in these hours. What has come forward is something more like simple awareness, present, Here, Laozi wrote, in a passage that has been translated many ways, but that always carries the same quality. Do you have the patience to wait until your mud settles and the water is clear? The mud is the urgency, the reaching, the measuring, the comparison. It is not bad mud. It is natural mud. Every mind has it. But when it is stirred constantly, the water cannot be seen. And when it is allowed to settle, which requires precisely the kind of stillness that the night provides, something clearer becomes available. The water does not clear by being forced to clear. It clears by being given the conditions in which settling is possible. The stillness, the absence of disturbance, the patience that is itself a kind of wisdom. Pace is something that the urgency mind experiences as a moral category. Too slow is a failing. Too fast is rarely recognized as a problem. The direction of error is always the same. Not enough progress, not fast enough, not visible enough to constitute adequate movement. But pace, considered differently, is simply a characteristic. Some things develop quickly. Some things develop slowly. And the pace appropriate to a particular development is not determined by preference or by cultural expectation. It is determined by the nature of the thing developing. Understanding, the genuine kind that changes how things appear rather than simply adding information, tends to develop slowly. It tends to require time and experience and repetition, and the particular quality of patience that allows things to sink in rather than simply pass through. You cannot rush the kind of understanding that changes a person at the level of what they find obvious and natural, rather than at the level of what they can remember and recite. Connection, in relationships and in communities, tends to develop slowly. Trust cannot be hurried without being damaged. The depth of knowing another person and being known is a function of time and attention and many shared experiences that each contribute invisibly to the total depth. Character, in the sense of reliable qualities that show up consistently across many different situations and circumstances, also develops slowly. It is shaped by choices repeated over time, by habits of attention that become gradually ways of seeing. It cannot be installed in a weekend or produced by a single decision, however sincere. These are not the only things that matter in a life, but they are among the things that most people, looking back over a long enough span of time, identify as having mattered most. And they are precisely the things that develop at a pace that cannot be forced, that do not leave clear external marks while they are developing, and that are therefore most vulnerable to being mistaken for the absence of progress. The night continues in its own way. The room is as it is. The sounds at the edges of hearing are as they are. The body is settling into the rest that it has been moving toward all day, through all the activity and the thought and the reaching and the quiet assessment of where things stand. The mind, too, is settling. The stream of thought, which James described as always moving, is moving more slowly now. The eddies of urgency are quieting. The evaluative function is releasing its grip, at least for tonight, at least for this particular hour. What remains as the thinking softens is something simpler, the fact of being here, the fact of the life continuing in its own way, at its own pace, with its own particular texture and direction. The fact of the breathing, which has been happening all this time and will continue to happen, unasked, through whatever comes next. The Stoics would say that what is within reach right now is simply this: the quality of awareness brought to this moment, the willingness to rest without urgency, the choice, if it can be called a choice, to allow the mind to release its grip on the future for the duration of this night. Marcus Aurelius wrote, toward the end of a long day of imperial responsibility, in the private pages of his notebook, "Sleep is a small death, and death is not to be feared." He was making a point about the natural rhythm of consciousness, the willingness to let go each night into the temporary dissolution of sleep is a kind of practice in allowing, in recognizing that the self can be released for a few hours and will reconstitute itself in the morning, without having lost anything essential. The life will be there in the morning, with its continuations and its open questions and its ongoing development, visible and invisible. The assessment will be there, if it wants to return. The forward movement will begin again, as it always does. But for now, there is only this: the room, the dark, the breathing, the mind that has spent some time tonight looking at its own experience with a little more patience and a little less urgency than it usually brings. That is not nothing. In fact, it is something. One of the most significant sources of the urgency feeling is the problem of evidence. The urgency mind requires evidence of progress. It looks for markers, for visible changes, for signs that movement is happening in the right direction. And when it finds the evidence sparse or ambiguous, it interprets the sparseness as a problem. But the relationship between evidence and reality is more complicated than the urgency mind tends to acknowledge. Evidence, in the sense of visible, external, categorically clear markers of change, is a specific kind of information. It is the kind of information that is easiest to share with others and easiest to count. When you tell someone that something has changed in your life, the things most easily communicated are the things most easily evidenced. A new role, a new location, a completed project, a recognized achievement. These communicate efficiently precisely because they are external and discrete. But much of what actually changes in a life is neither external nor discrete. Understanding deepens gradually, without a moment when it crosses a threshold that can be pointed to. The quality of how a person engages with difficult situations improves across many situations, without a single moment that constitutes the achievement of that improvement. The character of a person's relationships becomes richer across years of ongoing attention, without a milestone that marks the transition from less rich to richer. These changes are real, their effects are real, but they do not produce evidence in the form the urgency mind is looking for. Husserl's temporal consciousness is useful here. The changes that accumulate without clear markers are present in the retained experience of the past and in the pretended expectation of what is coming. They shape the quality of the present moment without being legible as discrete achievements. A person who has developed genuine understanding of a complex area has that understanding woven into how they perceive and respond. It is not a trophy displayed separately from the life. It is part of the texture of how the life proceeds. The absence of evidence, then, is not the same as the absence of development. It is a signal about the kind of development that has been happening. The interior, continuous, texture-changing kind, rather than the exterior, discrete, milestone-marking kind. And most of the development that matters most is of the first kind. There is a quality of attention that most philosophical traditions identify as important that is worth naming directly. It is the quality of being actually where you are. This sounds simple, but the urgency mind tends to produce a particular quality of not being where you are. When the mind is occupied with the gap between where life is now and where it should be, attention is, structurally, elsewhere. It is in the imagined future, measuring distance. It is in the past, assessing what went differently than expected. It is in the comparison space, where other lives are measured against this one. And while it is in those places, it is not fully present in the actual moment of experience. The philosophical traditions that have been most attentive to this tend to argue, in different ways, that full presence in the actual moment is both a good in itself and a condition for the best quality of action and development. Not because the past and future are unimportant, but because they can only be engaged with meaningfully from the ground of actual present awareness. The Taoist concept of wu-wei includes this: the action that aligns with the natural current, rather than forcing against it, requires a quality of attention that is actually present in the current situation, reading its actual texture and direction, rather than acting according to a predetermined plan that may or may not be appropriate to the actual conditions. The Stoic practice of attending to what is within reach similarly requires actual presence. You cannot accurately assess what is within reach if your attention is primarily occupied with what is not. The imagined future, the comparison space, the evaluation of whether pace is adequate. What is within reach is a quality of the present moment. It requires present attention to see clearly. Montaigne, who spent years examining the content of his own mind, found that the quality of his own experience changed when he brought his full attention to what was actually present rather than to some imagined standard or future state. He found that the present, fully attended to, had a richness that partial attention missed. That even the most ordinary moments, attended to with care and honesty, contained more substance than the urgency mind would grant them. This is not an instruction to practice any particular technique of attention. It is an observation about a quality that develops gradually through the sustained practice of noticing when attention has wandered into the evaluation space and allowing it to return to what is actually present. The observation itself, the noticing, is the practice. It does not require additional effort. It requires a willingness to see where attention actually is, without judgment. You may want to notice where attention is right now, in the room, in the thoughts, in the feelings in the body, in the space between thoughts, which is also a real thing, present alongside the thoughts themselves. There is a way that patience tends to be understood as a passive quality, the absence of urgency, the willingness to wait, a kind of suspension of activity while the world catches up with what is wanted. But patience, understood differently, is an active and intelligent quality. It is the capacity to remain engaged with a process across the time it actually requires, without forcing it to conform to a preferred timeline. This requires attention. It requires reading the actual rhythm of the process, rather than insisting on an externally imposed rhythm. It requires what the Taoists might call alignment with the actual current, rather than resistance to it. The intelligence of patience shows itself most clearly in retrospect. Looking back at a process that required a certain amount of time, the patience that allowed it to unfold fully tends to appear as a form of wisdom. The impatience that tried to force it forward tends to appear as interference that complicated rather than accelerated. But in the midst of the process, during the time when it is unfolding and not yet complete, the quality of patience can look indistinguishable from passivity. From a perspective inside the process, unable to see what it is becoming, the patience of remaining present and continuing without visible markers of progress can feel like stagnation. This is one of the central difficulties of the experience of being in time. The meaning of a period, including whether it was a period of active development or genuine stagnation, often cannot be accurately assessed from within it. The assessment requires a vantage point that only time provides. William James understood this in relation to thought. The stream of thought, he noted, often moves through periods that seem, in the moment, to be confused or stuck, only to arrive at a clarity that retrospect reveals as having been prepared by the apparently confused period. The confusion was not wasted time. It was the time during which the elements of clarity were being assembled, in ways that did not yet appear as clarity. This applies to the broader experience of life in time. The periods that feel most unclear, most like treading water, most like falling behind, are not necessarily the periods of least development. They are sometimes precisely the periods during which the foundations of what comes next are being established in ways that are invisible from within the period itself. There is something in the urgency mind that wants the question of where life is going to be answered now, tonight, in these quiet hours. It wants to know whether the current position will resolve into something that feels adequate, whether the development that cannot currently be seen will eventually become visible, whether the sense of being behind corresponds to something real, or is, as this reflection has been suggesting, a partial perception producing a misleading signal. These questions cannot be answered now. This is not a failure of the reflection. It is a feature of the relationship between consciousness and time. The future is genuinely not available from the present moment, and the evaluation of a period within a life, as noted earlier, requires a vantage point that the period itself cannot provide. The philosophical response to this is not to fill the uncertainty with optimism. The Stoics would not do that. Schopenhauer would not do that. Camus certainly would not do that. The philosophical response is to recognize the uncertainty clearly and to ask, given that the future is uncertain, what quality of engagement with the present is most available and most worthy of the actual life being lived? For the Stoics, the answer involved returning consistently to what is within reach, not the outcome, not the timeline, not the comparative position relative to others or to an imagined future, but the quality of choice and attention and engagement that is actually available right now. For Bergson, the answer involved a deeper relationship with the lived quality of time, a willingness to move through duration with genuine presence, rather than treating the present as merely an interim state on the way to something else. For the Taoists, the answer involved alignment with the natural current of things, which includes the natural current of not knowing. The Tao is not a plan. It is not a map. It is more like the quality of gravity, always present, always pulling in a consistent direction, without announcing itself or requiring acknowledgement to continue operating. For Montaigne, the answer was simply more honest attention to the actual interior of the life, more curiosity, less verdict, the willingness to examine what was actually present in its full complexity, rather than judging it against an external standard that did not fit it well. These answers are different from each other, but they share something. They each involve a shift of attention from the question that cannot be answered, where is this going, and when will it arrive, toward the quality of engagement with what is actually available, which is always, however it appears, the present moment in its full texture and reality. The darkness of the room right now has a quality worth noticing. It is the same darkness that has always accompanied rest for every person who has ever needed to sleep and found their way, eventually, to sleep. It is one of the most consistent features of being alive. The daily withdrawal of light, the body's signal to rest, the mind's gradual release of its grip on the problems of the day. The darkness does not judge the quality of what has been accomplished in the light. It does not keep a record of progress made or not made. It simply arrives, as it always does, and provides the conditions for rest that the body knows how to use. There is something in that neutrality that feels, if you allow it to, like a kind of kindness. The night does not require anything. It does not assess. It does not compare. It simply offers the conditions for restoration. Henri Bergson wrote about the way the body has its own intelligence, a practical, non-conceptual intelligence that handles the vast majority of what the organism needs to do. This intelligence does not require the explicit engagement of conscious reflection. It knows how to breathe, how to regulate temperature, how to coordinate the thousands of processes that sustain life, and it knows how to rest. It moves toward rest with a directness and efficiency that conscious deliberation cannot replicate. In the dark, with the day's activity behind you, the body is already working, already beginning the processes of recovery and integration that sleep will complete. The mind, if it can allow the urgency to soften for these hours, can participate in that process rather than working against it. This is not a demand. It is simply an observation about what is available. The body knows how to do this. The mind, in its gentler moments, allows it. There is an image from the Taoist tradition that returns in many forms across many centuries. It is the image of water and stone. Water is soft. It yields. When it encounters an obstacle, it does not attack the obstacle directly. It moves around it, through it where there are openings, over it when it rises high enough. It does not insist on a particular path. It takes the path that the landscape provides. And in doing so, over time, across time, that no single human life can fully witness, it shapes the stone. It carves valleys. It smooths surfaces that were once jagged. It creates the conditions for entirely new landscapes. The stone, by contrast, is hard. It holds its shape against the immediate pressure of the water. It does not yield. And yet, over the same timescale, it is the stone that changes, while the water, in its nature, remains water. This image is not primarily about patience as a strategy for winning against obstacles. It is about something more fundamental, the relationship between hardness and brittleness, and between softness and endurance. The urgency mind is, in some sense, stone-like. It holds its shape against the actual flow of things. It does not yield to the natural current of development, and in its holding, it accumulates a certain kind of internal stress. The Taoist invitation is toward something more water-like, not in the sense of giving up direction, but in the sense of finding the path that the actual landscape provides, rather than insisting on a different landscape. In the sense of flowing around what cannot be moved directly, rather than exhausting itself in frontal assault. In the sense of allowing the long arc of gradual change to do its work without constant interference. The person lying in the dark, in the quiet, in the gradual release of the day's urgency, is doing something water-like. They are not forcing anything. They are finding the path that the natural slope of tired consciousness provides. They are allowing the body's intelligence to lead toward the rest it knows how to take. And in that allowing, something continues. Below the surface of awareness, the processes that are not visible from within them continue their work. The understanding deepens. The development that cannot yet be seen continues. The water moves in its own way toward the sea. There is something useful about remembering that the morning already exists, in the sense that it is already a real part of time, already present in the structure of what is coming, even though it is not yet available to experience. The questions that feel most urgent tonight will still be there in the morning. The life will be there in the morning. And the morning, approached from within the restoration that sleep provides, tends to look slightly different from how it looks from within the exhaustion and quiet urgency of night. This is not a promise that the morning will solve anything. It is an observation about the relationship between the quality of consciousness and the quality of perception. The same circumstances, the same life, the same open questions appear differently from different states of awareness, and the state of awareness produced by genuine rest is different from the state produced by fatigue and late-night reflection. The Stoics called this the morning practice. Marcus Aurelius began each day with a period of preparation, a deliberate orientation toward what the day might bring and how he intended to engage with it. This practice was possible because the night had provided the restoration from which the clarity of a new day could emerge. Without the night, there would be no morning fresh enough for the morning practice. The night, then, is not simply the absence of day. It is part of the cycle. It is the condition for the quality of attention that the new day will require, and honoring it by allowing it to be what it is, by releasing the urgency for these hours, is not a failure of forward movement. It is a participation in the full rhythm of a life well lived. If you have been listening for a while now, there may be a quality of silence that has become more noticeable. Not the absence of sound exactly, though the room may be quiet, but something underneath the sounds that are present. A stillness that is always there, behind and beneath the movement of thought and perception and the activity of daily life. This stillness is not something to be achieved. It is not a state of mind to be produced through effort. It is what remains when the layers of urgency and evaluation and comparison are allowed to settle. It is always there. It is simply more accessible at some times than others. The mystics of many traditions have pointed toward this stillness as the most fundamental quality of awareness. The Taoist would recognize it as the Tao itself, which is always present behind the movement of things. The Stoic might recognize it as the rational structure underlying experience, always available to attention, regardless of what is happening on the surface. Montaigne found something like it in the patient examination of his own mind, a quality of witnessing that was distinct from what was being witnessed, and that had a certain equanimity that the contents of thought did not always share. This is not offered as a technique or a practice for tonight. It is simply a description of something that tends to become more available when the urgency softens. A quality of awareness that has been present all along, underneath the stream of thought, underneath the evaluation and comparison and reaching. It does not require the thoughts to stop. It simply requires that attention rest in a slightly wider frame than thought alone. The breathing is part of that wider frame. The weight of the body, the dark, the particular sounds of this particular hour, all of it together is the full texture of what is actually present. And what is actually present, in its full form, is always wider and richer and more various than the urgency mind's narrow focus allows. There may be someone listening tonight who feels the urgency most sharply, for whom the sense of being behind is not a gentle background hum, but something more insistent and specific, a situation with clear edges, a timeline that feels genuinely pressing, a gap between where things are and where they need to be that cannot easily be set aside through philosophical reflection. For those who find themselves here, this reflection does not offer any claim that the circumstances are not real. They are real. Specific difficulties are specific, and they do not become less specific through philosophy. What philosophy can offer, even in the most specific and difficult circumstances, is a shift in the quality of engagement with those circumstances. Not an erasure of the difficulty, but a slightly different relationship to it. A capacity to hold the difficulty within a wider frame than the difficulty alone provides. A recognition that even the most difficult chapter of a life is one chapter in a longer story, and that the meaning of the chapter is partly determined by what comes after it. Camus wrote, in The Myth of Sisyphus, about the capacity to imagine Sisyphus happy. Not because his situation had changed, not because the boulder had become lighter or the hill less steep, but because something in how Sisyphus related to his situation had changed. This is not consolation. It is a description of the human capacity for a quality of engagement that is not determined solely by external circumstances. Marcus Aurelius was emperor during plague and war and political treachery. His meditations were written not from a place of settled peace, but from within ongoing difficulty. And they are filled, not with denial of the difficulty, but with the quality of attention that can be brought to difficulty without being destroyed by it. A steady engagement, a clear-eyed recognition of what is within reach and what is not, a return again and again to the quality of the present moment as the only place where actual engagement is possible. This is offered to those who find the urgency most sharp tonight, not to dismiss the circumstances, but to suggest that even within them, the quality of engagement remains, to some extent, a choice, And the quality of the night, the rest that the body genuinely needs, the temporary release of the urgency for these hours, is available even within difficult circumstances. Perhaps most needed within them. The philosophers have been present throughout this reflection. Husserl, holding the mind's temporal reach, its retention and pretension. James, describing the continuous stream of thought that carries urgency and ease alike in its current. Schopenhauer, observing the restless forward reaching of the will, always at the horizon. Adler, noting that we are drawn by imagined futures as much as we are pushed by remembered pasts. Bergson, insisting on the richness of lived duration against the poverty of measured time. Spinoza, showing how emotional experience is shaped by interpretation, and how clarity changes the texture of experience. Montaigne, honest in his patient examination of the mind's operations. The Stoics, returning consistently to what is within reach. The existentialists, freeing the life from the obligation of any fixed sequence. The Taoists, describing the naturalness of unfolding that does not require urgency to proceed. All of these perspectives point, in different ways, toward the same possibility. Not that urgency can be eliminated. Not that the sense of being behind will simply dissolve with understanding, but that it can be seen more clearly, held within a wider frame, recognized for what it is. One signal among many, produced by the mind's evaluating function, using instruments that are genuinely useful in some contexts and genuinely misleading in others. The life being lived, whatever its current chapter, is not well described by the urgency mind's assessment alone. It contains more than that assessment can see. It is developing in ways that are not always visible as development. It is moving in a current that is not always moving at the pace the urgency mind prefers. And it will continue, in the morning and in the days that follow, to develop and unfold in ways that tonight cannot fully anticipate. What remains, when the philosophers have been heard, when the reflection has moved through its chapters, when the body has settled and the dark has deepened, is something simpler. The fact of being here, the life continuing, the breathing that happens without being asked to happen. This is not nothing. This is not a small thing. It is, in some sense, the only thing available. The actual present moment, with all of its quiet richness, and the life that continues within and through and beyond it. Let that remain.